What if? Is the great question that hangs over the heads of historians and allows for an imaginative look at an alternative version of events and positing the possible outcome had the circumstances been different. While it is impossible to really know what could have occurred, many writers and historians have speculated on the what if had the Axis powers won World War II, such as in Philip K. Dick's 1962 novel Man in the High Castle, which has since been popularized in the Amazon Prime series of the same name. But what if? What if Adolf Hitler's prediction that the Third Reich would last 1,000 years had happened? What would things look like under the boot of the Third Reich? Welcome to History Decoded, and today we will consider what the world would look like if Hitler had won the World War II and established a Third Reich that lasted 1,000 years. 1,000 years later, the world under the boot. For this scenario, we will focus on the European theater of the Second World War had the Axis powers won the war. The Japanese had subjugated the Asian continent and Pacific, while the Germans successfully conquered Europe, occupied Great Britain, and destroyed the Soviet Union government, pushing the remnants of the Russian authority east over the Ural Mountains into the Japanese-occupied territory. Spanish fascists were aided by the Germans to emerge victorious in the Spanish Civil War, and in turn helped Benito Mussolini build a new Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other British territories, commonwealths, protectorates, and colonies were forced to submit to the Axis authorities following the dismantling of the British authority. The United States failed to enter the war in time to prevent the Third Reich's invasion of Britain, instead choosing to become a neutral nation alongside the countries of Central and South America to preserve trade relations and avoid further bloodshed. After developing the atomic bomb first, and using a system of puppet governments and auxiliary forces made up of local militias to maintain control, the Germans built an authoritative administration that focused on economic growth, political oppression, military superiority, and social control. Over 1,000 years, Hitler and his descendants would have Germanized the European continent, draping all official and governmental buildings in swastikas, flags, portraits of Hitler and other important figures over the centuries, the Reichsadler eagle, and other Nazi symbols and murals. The official language of Europe would be German, and regulations on trade, policy, and behaviors would be strictly monitored under an intricate network of surveillance. Huge building projects would have been commissioned to commission the German aesthetic everywhere, and the destruction of national monuments accredited to others would have been destroyed. National and federal holidays to commemorate the victories, births, and deaths of battles and state heroes would be celebrated across Europe, and monuments and memorials would have been built. Laws forming formal relationships and guidelines between the Third Reich, their occupied territories, their allies, and the neutral nations would have been written and developed over the millennia, where German power maintained a firm grasp and forced other nations to bend to their will. Children would be sent to German-approved state schools, learning from a nationally permitted curriculum that included athletics, history, literature, first aid, biology, preliminary military training, art, mathematics, and languages. Military conscription for all males would be required, and they would serve at outposts across Europe, Africa, and the Americas to put down any and all resistance and maintain order. Some less physically capable would serve at the prisons, where the last of so-called undesirables of society, such as political opponents, criminals, Jews, and Roma, would be sent before execution or deportation. All able-bodied females would be required to work in either the auxiliary forces, medical corps, or in civil service after the completion of their education. The less physically able would work in administration. Those who failed to meet the requirements were fined. Those who tried to escape service were imprisoned. The military complex of a 1,000-year-old German empire would be massive, stretching across the European continent and utilizing militias to act as the right hand for the German authority. The Third Reich's weapons division would be unrivaled, with atomic and nuclear capacity, armaments development, and defensive measures. No standing army would be able to combat the Third Reich, and its advanced air force and navy would suppress any efforts to move troops to attack Europe, guarding the whole of Europe and Atlantic. Expansion efforts would have been paramount and tantamount to the Third Reich's control of the globe, launching expeditions across the world. Military bases in the North and South Poles would have been established, and access to resources and supplies vital for keeping power. Space exploration would have been made an important focus for scientific innovation, with a desire to build a base on the Moon and Mars. And missions to map the oceans and study marine life would also have been essential. Hospitals would record and then terminate newborns born with deformities or genetic disorders, and individuals diagnosed with mental disorders would be treated, but many would be sterilized or executed depending on their conditions. Experiments on non-Aryans would have been common in a millennium of a Third Reich, with research, exposure to illness or conditions, surgeries and antibiotics tested on, quote, undesirables like Jews and non-Aryan people who had been specifically bred to be studied and tested on. Controlled eugenics and genetic programs be instated to limit certain populaces from procreating, and mass sterilization of non-Aryans would have been common. Aryan women between the ages of 16 to 40 would be encouraged to have as many children as possible, raising large families with Aryan husbands to grow the desired population. The law would be strict and swift. Imprisonment was only for lesser crimes, such as civil disobedience, burglary, or fighting, while execution was what awaited serious criminals, such as those raped or murdered. Similarly, political enemies or those who committed the perceived atrocity of miscegenation, or having relations with someone outside of your own race, would face the death penalty. Jews, homosexuals, Roma, Soviets, Poles, partisan rebels, criminals, dissidents, and political prisoners who during the Second World War would have been incarcerated and in all likelihood killed in the concentration camps would have had their numbers cut down significantly, with many perishing in efficient camps. Numbers of those killed in the concentration camps over the 1,000-year reign of the Third Reich would no doubt have reached tens of millions. A number of the intended targets would have escaped to the neutral nations as refugees, while others were allowed to live in Europe as exhibits in zoos, university displays, or in hospitals for research purposes. Some impartial nations would send some undesirables back to Europe to be arrested and sent to camps, but other neutral countries allowed limited numbers to enter and live in select zones of remote towns, farming regions, or in cities heavily monitored and restricted by the local governments. Nazi officials and commanders would oversee local governments, which would either answer directly to the Nazi administration or act as a puppet state and keep a tight grasp on the residents. Over the 1,000 years, small independent states would develop but maintain a German identity and work in conjunction with the Third Reich as satellite nations. Neutral nations would either maintain their sovereignty to keep the peace with the Germans or become part of the Third Reich should the local governments shift to favor Nazi policy or having fallen to the Nazi authority in later wars. Resistance would cost millions of lives and leave Germany wanting. Most likely, despite the efforts of the Third Reich's legacy regime lasting 1,000 years, resistance and dissidence would be found throughout the realm and would undermine any and all of the German effort to maintain power. After Hitler's death, even if a direct heir had been chosen or confirmed, the Nazi administration, like many preceding empires, would have had a succession crisis somewhere down the line, with the formation of different factions within the government battling for control. One splinter group, perhaps similar to Erwin Rommel, who believed in building a powerful German nation but never agreed with the oppressive policies of Nazism, would most likely have loosened the brutality against the perceived enemies of Germany and focused on building colonies and outposts in foreign nations to gain access to natural resources had he assumed power. Those who favored a more Joseph Goebbels political slant, on the other hand, would look to destroy the enemies of Nazis, putting the destruction of neutral nations harboring perceived dissenters first above other policy in the federal government, achieved through sanctions and occupation. No doubt many other variations on governance would arise, and conflict with their neighbors would only fuel further issues. The disagreement between political coalitions derived from the original Nazi Party would have shared the fundamental ideals of how to rule and what to do within the government, but would lead to some violence, as we saw with the rise of Nazism in the 1920s and 1930s. The many divisions of politicians and military personnel would, at least at some point of the 1,000 years of the Third Reich, combat one another. There would be all-out battles between military divisions, support and protests by local populations, and a rise in political division. There would be occasions where similar purges to the Night of the Long Knives, when the SA was systematically hunted down, imprisoned, and executed and replaced with the SS, would take place to dismantle civil opponents. This, in turn, would lead to uprisings, harsh voting suppression, and political nonconformity within the Third Reich, shaking the empire's grasp on Europe. Regardless of the Third Reich's power over the course of 1,000 years, rebellions would never end, and most likely never be defeated. Fascist ideologies like Nazism, like all political ideologies, is deeply fallible, and national sovereignty and identity cannot be destroyed by any government despite violent efforts or oppression. Resilience would allow for counter-ideologies to thrive and grow. This has been true in nearly every empire, from ancient Rome to the Holy Roman Empire to the Ottoman Empire, and the Third Reich wouldn't have been different. Resistance groups would be significant throughout the Third Reich and the neutral states, with violence raving whole regions and countries for hundreds of years, ebbing and flowing with the waves of partisan ideologies growing and waning with time. Nazi Germany would have some support and means to fight the Jewish supporters, democratic rebels, Soviet allies, and anti-fascist enemies. But having them embedded in both the local governments and the foreign territories would make control difficult, especially if these groups work together to cause economic and administrative problems for the Germans across the Third Reich and neutral lands. Rebel forces would have likely battled with the Germans and their puppet state authorities, attacking convoys, destroying munition factories, military outposts, and prisons, while also undermining the trade and commerce that allowed for the Nazis to prosper. The United States, while agreeing to remain neutral against the Third Reich, would be a hotbed of dissidents, with communist and democratic factions appearing across the country and working with neighboring nations like Mexico and Canada to raise an army. British and French rebels would have infiltrated the Third Reich's power bloc and helped uproot their grip by gaining support from within the country. These locals, furious over lack of means to thrive on their own accord, would show support to the rebels, either quietly or publicly, to combat the German effort. Violence would be rampant and common, with insurgents designated as terrorists and rebels. Even if the Germans bombed one of the rebel regions, others would no doubt rise up, as we saw during the Second World War. Resistance groups were just as important in helping to defeat the Germans, as was the military of Britain, United States, and the Soviet Union. In 1,000 years, even the Nazis could not stop all the revolts. And even if they crushed a lot of uprisings, no doubt it would cost them billions to fund the wars and millions of lives to win, or at least slow down the rebellions. It is always a great mental game to think about what it might have been and to have some idea of what the world might have looked like if scenarios had played out differently. Worst-case scenarios are always a favorite, and a massive fascist empire would have been horrific. In this case, millions of people would have been oppressed and executed. Wars would have occurred on and off for centuries, and devastation at the hands of a few would have been both commonplace and ordinary, and day-to-day life might have been a mixture of fear and humdrum banality. Even though millions did die during the Second World War, who knows how many more, millions to billions perhaps, would have been killed if Nazi Germany had won the war. Thankfully, the Third Reich fell in 1945, with the Allied powers emerging victorious, destroying Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Third Reich. Thank you for watching our speculation on what would the world look like after 1,000 years under the Third Reich here on History Decoded. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Feel free to leave a comment below about other topics we should cover. Thank you again, and until next time, this is History Decoded.